Pleasant and very warm greetings to everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the roadmap to the sustainable and responsible financial inclusion of FDPs, the role of financial regulators and other stakeholders, co-hosted by AFI and German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. My name is Hanako Nishigori. I am Manager for Global Partnerships and Donor Relations at AFI, and I will be supporting today's webinar. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Alfred Hannig, Executive Director of AFI, and Ms. Linnea Kreibohm, Senior Policy Officer, German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you for joining this webinar. And also to our esteemed panelists, Mr. Joscha Albert, Financial Sector Specialist, GIZ, Ms. Lisa Klinger, Advisor, GIZ, Ms. Mariam Zahari, Policy Analyst, AFI, Mr. Moise Bigirimana, Manager, Financial Inclusion, Education and Consumer Protection, National Bank of Rwanda, Ms. Kelsey Weber, Rural Livelihoods Officer, International Rescue Committee, Ms. Swati Mehta, Research Associate, Catholic University, Eichstätt, and Mr. Tidhar Wald, Deputy Managing Director, Better Than Cash Alliance. And finally, we are delighted to have Ms. Chrissy Meier, who is a digital finance and ID technical expert and the lead author of the roadmap to moderate today's session. Warm welcome to you all. And as you see on the agenda, following the opening remarks and introduction by our moderator, we will have polls where participants' input will be shared. And then we will have the plenary session, starting with the presentation of the roadmap and its relevance during the COVID-19 from GIZ representatives. Then we will hear from the National Bank of Rwanda and AFI Management Unit on the experience in the implementation of the roadmap, followed by presentation from International Rescue Committee and FIN program. Finally, we will have presentation from the Better Than Cash Alliance on delivering digital financial services responsibly for FDPs. After the plenary session, we will have time for Q&A and discussion. So without further ado, I would like to now welcome Dr. Alfred Hannig, Executive Director of AFI, to provide his opening remarks. The floor is yours, Alfred.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone around the globe. It's very nice to have you all with us. And I just wanted to send you our warm greetings and welcome you to this BMZ AFI webinar on the roadmap to the sustainable and responsible financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, the FDPs. We will, of course, focus quite a bit of this discussion today on the role of the financial regulators in terms of improving the situation of this group through equitable access to high quality financial services. Now, let me be very short this afternoon. It's afternoon for me. I'm here in Europe at the moment because I think we have 1.5 hours, which will be very packed. And we should actually cut down on our openings quite a bit so that we can get to the content discussions as soon as possible. Nevertheless, let me say that I'm, of course, very excited to see that we have around 200 registrants for this event, which is jointly hosted with the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, the BMZ, a key partner for AFI for so many years, and BMZ also supported by GIZ to make this webinar happen. So thank you for co-hosting. Just a few days ago, I think on 20 June, we received the World Refugee Day, the report on the World Refugee Day. We received the report from the UNHCR on that date, and I think the numbers are very worrisome. We have read again that we have almost 80 million people who were forcibly displaced from their homes or countries due to conflict and persecution, and out of these, 26 million were refugees. 45.7 million were internally displaced persons or IDPs, and 4.2 million were asylum seekers. And what is quite strikingly for us, I think, is that 68%, excuse me, 68% of the total number of the FDPs come from just 5 countries, namely the Syrian, Arab Republic, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Now, when we look at the numbers, of course, we also need to appreciate the specific challenges faced by women and youth FDPs. And based on the available data, we can say that at a global level, the proportion of women and girls in the refugee population was at least 48% in 2019, whereas children under 18 represented about 50%, and young adults aged 18 to 24 a further 13%. I think that this signals a need to already begin devising long-term solutions for a growing population of displaced youth who would otherwise be extremely socially and economically excluded from our systems and lack access to economic opportunities. And now, on top of everything, the COVID-19 global pandemic has further underlined systematic inequalities that are still present within our formal financial systems. And I think we are now becoming increasingly aware that it is especially the poor who are hit most by this crisis, and even more the forcibly displaced person. And there are, of course, the impact of the health crisis, because this group will find it and finds it very difficult to practice what others call the social distancing. So they are very much exposed to the specific risks of COVID-19, but also the economic impact of the crisis will hit this group specifically hard. And I think this is something that we have to take into account, especially when we talk about the solutions such as financial inclusion, which we see as a durable solution. And we have seen very impressive practical approaches from AFI members such as the Central Bank of Jordan, the Bank of Tanzania, Bank of Uganda, the National Bank of Rwanda, the Banque Centrale de Mauritanie, and the Afghanistan Bank, who have shown commendable leadership in leveraging financial inclusion as a dignified and empowering solution to what is traditionally viewed as a humanitarian policy challenge. They have promoted the collection of appropriately disaggregated financial inclusion data on FDPs. They included FDPs into their national financial inclusion strategies. They lowered the know your customer requirements for FDPs, and they also implemented digital financial literacy programs for FDPs. They also established, in some cases, new relationships with crucial stakeholders, such as those from the humanitarian and fintech sectors. Now, all this is, of course, part of a global agenda, and AFI is very committed to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And our aspiration, in the same spirit of this agenda, is really to leave no one behind, including the FDPs. And this, I think, has also been emphasized in the Kigali statement that we, as a network, committed to last year in Rwanda when we held the Global Policy Forum in September 2019. Let me end this brief introduction just by, again, welcoming you, wishing you a very fruitful discussion on this very, very critical topic. It is against the background of the critical situation of millions of FDPs that we have chosen to co-organize this very timely webinar. And I hope that you will find it very useful, and I hope it will and can make a difference for the FDPs. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon, morning, and evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfred. Honored guests, let me now invite Ms. Linnea Kreibohm, Senior Policy Officer, German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, to provide her opening remarks. The floor is yours, Linnea.
Thank you. I'm pleased to welcome you also on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Let me begin by saying thank you to Alfred Hannig and the entire AFI team for organizing this webinar and for our long-standing close cooperation. We are particularly pleased to work closely with AFI and other strategic partners, many of whom are also participating in this webinar today, on the issue of the implementation of the roadmap on financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons. Financially including forcibly displaced persons contributes to improving people's livelihoods and their ability to participate economically. Especially now, as Alfred said, we have seen that people who have been forcibly displaced need ways to safely receive cash assistance and remittances, but also ways to save and prepare for future crises. BMZ has therefore actively worked to put the topic of financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons on the international agenda. We made the topic a priority during the German G20 presidency in 2017, and in December 2019, we formally launched the roadmap on financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, together with our partners at the first Global Refugee Forum in Geneva. My colleagues Lisa and Joscha from the GIZ will present further details on the roadmap later in this webinar. We also at the BMZ actively support the implementation of the roadmap. Specifically, BMZ works with AFI to support national regulators and policymakers on this. And I am glad that Moise from the Central Bank of Rwanda will share their experiences with us today. Furthermore, BMZ supports research to better understand how forcibly displaced persons manage their financial lives and what behavioral patterns influence their decisions. I am delighted to have Swati share some first results from the FIND, Finance and Displacement Research Project, which is supported by the BMZ. I am convinced the roadmap is a first step to help guide us to new ways of collaboration and action to improve the lives of people who have been forcibly displaced. And I look forward to our exchange today and encourage you all to share your views on the topic and on ways to translate the ambitious roadmap into concrete actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linnea. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce our technical moderator for today, Ms. Chrissy Meier. Chrissy, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Anako, and to Dr. Hannig and Ms. Kreibohm for the introductory remarks and for reminding us of the scale of this challenge, which is only growing today. I'm thrilled to be with you all today to discuss this roadmap and the progress that has been made thus far and all of the work that we have to do going forward. By way of introduction, I am a consultant based in Switzerland, currently working with the Center for Financial Inclusion at Accion, as well as with the G2PX initiative at the World Bank. I had the honor of playing a role in the development of the roadmap, both serving on the temporary steering committee under the German presidency, as well as helping to write and to workshop the roadmap in The Hague in September 2018. There were many more steps along this journey to get to the launch in December of 2019 at the Global Refugee Forum, which you will hear later from our speakers from GIZ. The world as we know it has changed drastically in unimaginable ways since December 2019, since the launch. And yet, as we heard from our introductory speakers, the problem of financial inclusion for forcibly displaced persons is more relevant than ever, especially as we think about resiliency and the need to help people withstand shocks and to participate in the economy and to save for the future so that they can be prepared for future crises. So our objective today is really to remind all of us of the policy recommendations within the roadmap, to think about how these have been implemented, to hear really about the concrete opportunities and challenges from many of our speakers, and to discuss how we can ensure that these recommendations stay relevant in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. So to kick off the session, we wanted to hear from you all. As you heard, there will be 3 polls coming up on your screen, I believe in succession. So if you can answer all 3, and take just a brief couple of minutes to do so. They shouldn't be too hard. Just to get your thoughts, and then we will put up the results so we can discuss. Hannig, I cannot see the results, so I will leave it to you to let us know when we look like most people have responded. You can wrap up just about now, and we can get ready to display the results. Great. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the results on their screen. And so I think, not surprisingly, we're seeing in the first questions on which stakeholder plays the most important role, a large majority stated all of the above, which I think is a key theme of the roadmap is coordination and cooperation. So this is not surprising. At the same time, we see a large role for policymakers and regulators. Again, not surprising considering our audience and being hosted by AFI, but also because of the key role that stakeholder plays. So I think we'll hear a lot more about bringing those stakeholders together during the discussion today. In terms of thinking about what is the largest obstacle towards advancing financial inclusion, we were able to select all that apply, and we see matching the same theme is the lack of an enabling policy and regulatory environment. So I think that's helpful to that the key stakeholders can be involved in solving some of those challenges. And again, I think we'll hear a lot about that today, as well as the limited financial awareness and the need for more multi-stakeholder coordination. And finally, we're seeing on this last question in terms of specifically the response to COVID-19, that governments and institutions were able to respond by easing access to digital financial services, which I think was one of the really exciting responses that we saw coming very quickly globally. So great to see that many here were involved in that. And a large role in other, which will be good to hear in the Q&A session from you all, some of the other ways that you were able to respond, as well as, of course, incentivizing the use of contactless payments to keep with social distancing regulations. So thank you all for participating. I think this will be very helpful to the speakers as they target their presentations to make sure that it's relevant and interesting. So I will now hand it over to our colleagues from GIZ, Ms. Lisa Klinger and Joscha Albert, who will provide context on the roadmap and its development, as well as its relevance to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hello, everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we could.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. So I'm Joscha Albert, and together with my colleague Lisa, I have the great pleasure to present the roadmap within the next 10 minutes about, and we will outline the process of getting there, the structure, the content, and as well show how it relates then to the current developments in times of COVID-19. Here you can see the first slide, and this is actually the question we had in mind when we initiated the G20 initiative in 2017 under Germany's G20 presidency. And I think the most recent numbers mentioned by Alfred, sadly, but at the same time impressively underlines the fact that focusing on FDPs is maybe even more important today than ever before. So it's a relevance which is on the agenda as well today. Here, I will briefly talk about the journey. Please stop the slides before here the journey. I think these documents here illustrate nicely what happened over the last 3 years. It was a journey we have gone together with many of you, and I'm really happy to see many of the partners of this alliance here today in the webinar. And I'm really happy as well, or pleased to see that the discussions we had right from the beginning has shifted, and it's now much more about how we can improve the access to financial services for FDPs than it was before. Then in the beginning, we talked a lot about why financial services are important for FDPs. So next slide, please. So as already mentioned, with the support of many of you, we have been able to attract attention and to put the topic on the international agenda for the first time, I would say. Then all together, so the whole process and the drafting of the roadmap. And I have to add that Chrissy was not only playing a little role, she was playing a key role in drafting the roadmap. So our moderator is well aware of what the roadmap is all about. Thanks again, Chrissy. So the whole process and the drafting of the roadmap was truly a multi-stakeholder approach, and we did a lot to really ensure that the roadmap reflects the perspectives of all relevant stakeholders. And the interesting part here is that it's not so common that we in the financial inclusion community or in the community of financial systems development are working closely with the colleagues, for example, from the humanitarian sector. So this was really something where we learned a lot and which was really fruitful. And I'm happy to see as well a couple of colleagues from IRC and other humanitarian organizations here in the webinar today. And thirdly, this roadmap is a guidance for all stakeholders. So it offers a wide set of recommendations for each stakeholder, and you can have a look at it, what's in there, and Lisa will present in detail what it's about. This picture is maybe a bit weird, at least for the people having summertime now, but I think it nicely symbolizes all three aspects I just mentioned here, which are here on the three bullets on the left side of the slide. Next slide, please. So in addition, I just want to mention that the main objectives of the roadmap are still stimulating further research and dialogue. That's what we are hoping for, and why we are here today, enhancing coordination and collaboration, and then as well, as already mentioned by Linnea, supporting the translation of results and finding into action. And I think it's important to really join forces and to do it together because everyone can play an important role here. And I will now hand over to Lisa, who will present in more detail what the roadmap is about and what the content is. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Joscha. Thanks for the introduction, and also thanks a lot for the welcoming remarks. So I'm Lisa, I'm working with Joscha at GIZ on this topic, and we can switch to the next slide, please. And I would like to give you a greater overview of the topic areas that are actually covered by the roadmap and that we have identified based on the key obstacles that actually prevail at different levels to financial inclusion of FDPs. And those obstacles we find at the micro up to the macro level. So starting from a lack of financial literacy up to regulatory obstacles such as regarding AML or CFT requirements by still ensuring financial stability. And let me start with the first point, national strategies and regulations. I'm actually pleased to see that most of you see a need or see that there is a great challenge to face, and that this is reflected in our roadmap as well. So it is true that most of the national financial inclusion strategies, for example, do not consider FDPs as a special target group, and those do not consider the specific circumstances there and, for example, their legal status. Furthermore, it is important, especially now, we can see that financial infrastructure has to reach FDPs and local host population, for example, also in remote areas and camps, but also by ways of digital means, which now in times of lockdown, social distancing, etc., even become more relevant. And then customer identification. So it is true that FDPs often lack a formal proof of their identification or origination. So the roadmap gives guidance on which alternative ways of proving identification can be used, so that financial services providers actually can provide services, for example, mobile wallets to vulnerable groups such as FDPs. And by nature of displacement, it is true that FDPs are more vulnerable and also may have a higher concern for privacy concerns. That's why the topic on financial consumer and data protection is of utmost importance and is one part of the recommendations of the roadmap. And financial inclusion also gives an opportunity to bridge the short-term approaches of humanitarian aid and development and the long-term approaches of development cooperation, such as Joscha just mentioned. That's why we also try to bring together not only development actors, governments, and the private sector, but also are in very close cooperation and dialogue with humanitarian actors that, for example, at the moment provide a lot of cash assistance that then can be in longer term also transferred into mobile wallet and used for further financial inclusion activities. And last but not least, let me emphasize that financial inclusion essentially is also a means to economic participation, and through economic participation also the demand for financial inclusion increases at the same time. And just let me dive a little bit deeper into what the roadmap can actually offer in terms of recommendations when looking into specific areas that are, however, closely interlinked. Next slide, please. So first of all, as mentioned earlier, the specific circumstances need to be addressed by national financial inclusion strategies. Why? Because they're often perceived as higher risk, for example, due to a lack of identification documents, but also because they come from countries that often face sanctions due to terrorism or money laundering risks. They are in greater need for protection and also may have varying levels of financial and digital literacy than the average citizen. And that's why we recommend to have those needs in mind when designing national strategies, allowing for risk-based regulations, and also align those efforts with other relevant ministries that are concerned with refugee needs. And a nice example is actually the Jordan National Financial Inclusion Strategies that has identified refugees as one of the target groups. And let me also stress one other important aspect that is covered by the roadmap. Next slide, please. That is digital financial services that have been mentioned before already as very important, especially during the times of crisis. And why so? Because especially now, vulnerable people, poor people are in need of cash support. They may have another source of external support, such as remittances, and also such as the local host population. They should be still able to transfer money and payments. That's why, especially now, digital financial services are of utmost importance. And the roadmap does cover recommendations around digital onboarding, KYC requirements, leveraging government-to-person payments, but also shows how to, for example, incentivize consumers through, for example, awareness campaigns or literacy trainings, and merchants to make use of digital payment methods. And here is a nice picture that is an alternative way of identification, for example, through the iris scan being used mostly in Jordan at the moment. And just one last aspect, next slide please, that I would like to highlight here is the role of data and consumer protection as well as financial digital literacy, because it is knowledge, skills and trust that essentially enable and allow consumers to use digital payments. Without the three of those areas, what we observe is that actually digital financial services are not being used, or you, for example, register for mobile wallet but do not any longer use it. And these are the three areas that I wanted to highlight, especially when it comes to also the relevance today. But before starting off with allowing you for some questions, let me just show you the entire range of partners that have supported our efforts to launch the roadmap in 2019. And now, Chrissy, back to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa and Joscha, for giving us a taste of what's in the roadmap. I reread it myself this morning, and there is actually a lot of really concrete recommendations in there. I'm remembering from a few years back, so it's worth taking a look at for those of you that are less familiar with the content. So we will now move on to our colleagues from AFI and Ms. Mariam Zahari, who will be joined by Moise Bigirimana from the Central Bank of Rwanda. Over to you.
Absolutely, Chrissy. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for AFI to present here along with this excellent lineup of fellow panelists and friends with whom we have been working closely during the development of the roadmap in recent years and now during its implementation. In fact, AFI and our members such as the Bank of Tanzania led the drafting of the roadmap's chapter on national strategies and regulation. And in addition to that, also provided reviews throughout its iterations. So the roadmap is very dear to us, and we hope that this webinar will help us draw some parallels in terms of challenges, but also to think about some meaningful next steps for our recovery from COVID-19 and for our broader journey to advance financial inclusion for FDPs. Let me provide you with an outline of the key areas in which we are implementing the roadmap with our members. To start off, our objective is to practically apply the recommendations presented in the roadmap as just shared by Joscha and Lisa, but specifically as they relate to the policy and regulatory aspect of creating a conducive environment and ecosystem for FDP financial inclusion. So we've begun work with three of our members, namely Banque Centrale de Mauritanie, National Bank of Rwanda, and the Afghanistan Bank, who each have their own unique forced displacement contexts and are home to either refugees, such as in the case of Mauritania and Rwanda, or internally displaced persons and returnees in the case of Afghanistan. Over time, despite their differing contexts, we realized that across the board, we really needed to first ensure that FDPs are being included in our national financial inclusion strategies, or NFIS. And as we know, NFIS are vital for galvanizing a whole of government and multi-stakeholder approach to advancing financial inclusion in line with the principles of financial stability, financial integrity, and consumer protection. So as government endorsed policies, NFIS are an important reference for financial service providers willing to extend their products and services to the forcibly displaced. Therefore, we agreed that NFIS are a critical starting point to creating an enabling policy and regulatory environment for financial inclusion at the country level. However, just as quickly, we came to understand that we already faced several hurdles. One, there was very limited coordination, collaboration, and awareness among relevant stakeholders, that is between financial policymakers and regulators, ministries providing services to FDPs such as the ministries of Interior, Social Affairs or Migration, humanitarian and development partners such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees or the UNHCR, ministries dealing with identification, the National Financial Intelligence Unit to address AML-CFT concerns as they relate to FDPs, and of course the private sector. Two, there was hardly any reliable, robust, and appropriately disaggregated financial inclusion data on FDPs. Without such data, we were not able to diagnose the state of FDP financial inclusion to establish a baseline on which we could then develop FDP-specific indicators and targets within the strategy. Three, there was a need to already address the financial and digital literacy gap among FDPs so that their financial inclusion can sustain beyond just gaining access to formal financial services. Now, all three members have digital financial services, or DFS, as enablers or pillars of either their completed NFIS or their forthcoming NFIS. So in this regard, we knew that there needs to be very deliberate efforts to build trust in DFS and normalize digital payments whilst considering proper outreach to FDPs. So in response to these challenges, what we have done is, firstly, we've completed multi-stakeholder mapping and SWOT analyses for Mauritania, Rwanda, and Afghanistan with the members. So due to very limited visibility of FDP financial, the ecosystem of FDP financial inclusion in the countries, there was an urgent necessity to conduct thorough multi-stakeholder mapping and SWOT analyses with the members. So we have now leveraged these to identify challenges and opportunities for integrating FDPs into their NFIS. Secondly, we promoted the collection of financial inclusion data on FDPs to develop a sound diagnostic on their state of financial inclusion. And given the need for data, we're making strong efforts to improve the quality and availability of detailed, appropriately disaggregated primary data. That is, that they are disaggregated by age, sex, and geographic location on displaced persons to inform financial inclusion policymaking. For example, through establishing important partnerships between the central banks with the UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies, their national statistics systems, and relevant ministries to ensure that there is sound coordination in collecting and analyzing such data. Finally, we have facilitated multi-stakeholder coordination and collaboration. As financial policymakers and regulators, our members play a critical role in devising durable and responsible policy solutions together with the wider community that has been dealing with forced displacement within the countries for many decades now. For instance, by leveraging AFI's unique peer-to-peer learning model, we've conducted multi-stakeholder consultative workshops with BCM in Mauritania, with participation from members such as the Central Bank of Burundi and Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. We also involved the Ministry of Interior and Decentralization, who deals with refugee issues in the country, and the UNHCR. So it was used as a platform to sensitize all the national NFIS stakeholders to the issue of FDP financial inclusion and to raise their awareness about the importance of including them in the NFIS towards fully inclusive economic growth and sustainable development. So this resulted in the identification of FDPs as a target group in the NFIS. Let me end with that. I thank you again, and I look forward to some of the discussion after we hear from the other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Mariam. I think we will now move on to hear a bit more about the humanitarian and research side of the roadmap implementation. I'm passing it over to Ms. Kelsey Rober from the International Rescue Committee and to Swati Mehta from Catholic University. Thank you. Oh, excuse me. First, we will hear from the National Bank of Rwanda. Is that correct?
No, it's the next one.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Swati.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Warm greetings to everyone. It is great to see a lot of participation from financial policymakers today. I will be speaking about some of the initial research findings from our project FIND, which is short for Finance and Displacement. Very quickly, a little bit about the project first. Next slide, please. This project was conceived to address one of the priority areas of data and evidence identified in the GPFI policy paper that Joscha already mentioned. It is being implemented by a consortium of 2 academic institutions. So it's Katholische Universität, where I work, and Tufts, together with IRC, which brings in the service provider as well as the policy perspective. Now, we in our approach, we try to bring together the perspectives from refugees, supply side, and the policy side to identify policy and programmatic interventions. Next slide, please. The research is being conducted, like the project has 2 focus countries, which is Jordan and Kenya, and it's been conducted over a period of 3 years. I am responsible for the project, for running the project in Jordan together with IRC. And today I'll be discussing some of the findings from our research in Jordan. So we are currently doing in-depth interviews with 89 respondents, and we would be doing 3 rounds of in-depth interviews with the same set of respondents, and we have already conducted 1 round. The second round is underway, and that also includes the impact of COVID. And the third round of interviews would happen towards the end of this year. So this allows us to look at their financial journey over a period of time. These respondents are in non-camp settings because in Jordan, more than 80% of the refugees stay outside of camps, and they are mainly in urban areas. And our sample, it's important to note that our sample is split equally into Syrians and non-Syrians, where the latter forms about 14% of the refugee population and remains the most vulnerable as they're excluded from the labor market measures and a lot of development programming. Even the National Financial Inclusion Strategy, while it identifies refugees as one of the important target groups and allows them to open mobile wallets using a card, using a relaxed KYC, which is a card issued by the Ministry of Interior. Non-Syrian refugees do not have access to this KYC document, and the non-Syrians include the biggest 4 groups, which is Iraqis, Yemeni, Sudanese, and Somalis. Next slide, please. So the most impactful exercise that we did with our research respondents is mapping of their financial journeys since they arrived in Jordan. So you see on the 2 axes, the time since their displacement and the corresponding financial situation. And we requested the respondents to map their financial ups and downs on this. While we know that each respondent's journey and their challenges are unique, but as we zoom out, we see there are these 4 types of journeys which are most common. Before getting into the details of these, it's important to understand that only a quarter of refugees in Jordan receive any kind of regular monthly cash transfers, and almost all respondents have some income from work, even if they get assistance every month. And this income is usually from irregular informal sector jobs with very low daily wages. Only a few respondents we saw were able to get formal, better paying jobs, but even for them, those jobs were not very stable in the long run, and there was always fear of losing jobs or the business collapsing or facing losses. So quickly looking at the first case, these are respondents who receive fixed monthly assistance, and we see that the graph for them looks like a flat curve as they're able to meet their the most pressing needs, which is shelter and food with the cash assistance. But there is high dependence on this as the income from work still remains very low and unstable. So any increase in their expenses, often which comes with childcare or increasing family size or with health shocks, their curve is pushed down. So it starts to deteriorate. In cases 2 and 3, the blue and the yellow one, we see those who have either reducing assistance over time, reducing cash assistance over time, or those who haven't received any assistance at all since they arrived in Jordan. And while the income from work, even for them, remains low and unstable, and expenses rise, more and more of these vulnerable families see themselves in debt and adopting negative coping strategies such as reducing food expenditure, selling assets, and taking adolescent children out of school to work. Now, these 3 cases, the last 2 actually are the ones, the yellow and the blue one are the ones which were seen to be the most common. And these 3 cases, the first 3 cases that I just explained, together are the vast majority of refugees in Jordan, and they come into this category which is more around survivalihood. So they are able to earn, their livelihoods are only able to help them survive, and they are not able to build any kind of savings or assets or improve their capacities to improve their financial situation in the long term. So they're stuck in this sort of survivalihood phase. The exception, the minority situation is the fourth case, which is the green one. And these are respondents which we saw were able to make gradual progress as they were able to find better paying jobs, or they were able to start profitable businesses, improve their professional capacities, leverage their strong social networks. And these were the ones who were seen to have more savings and a better access to capital as well. However, even in this graph, we would see that sometimes there could be dips, and these dips happen when they face legal issues or losses, because the labor market measures still don't allow Syrian refugees to own assets and completely have ownership of their businesses. So and many of the businesses run by Syrians are actually not legally registered. They still operate in the informal sector. So there is always the fear of losing their businesses or getting into legal issues. And however, this is one case, this is one set of respondents which we see were able to ratchet up. So they were able to make step-by-step progress in their financial situation, and were better informed about financial services, were better able to manage their finances and save and have access to credit. While understanding all of this, we should also remember that the economic situation in Jordan is declining. So it has not been improving, and with COVID, it's on a further decline. So many of our respondents mentioned that 2019 perhaps has been the worst year for them, even before the COVID crisis started. However, there were exceptions for whom things were improving, but for a vast majority, things were not improving since we last met them last year in 2019. Next slide, please. So like I said, majority are stuck in survivalihood phase. And I would like to point out here that housing, so rent and utilities and health expenses, these are the two most difficult financial needs that most are just struggling to meet. And these are for the first three cases that I spoke about. And most of the non-Syrian refugees actually remain in this survivalihood phase because, like I said, they have legal issues in being able to get formal, stable jobs, and hence they are not able to improve their situation. Next slide, please. You can move to the next. So based on all of this, if we have to look at recommendations, I would talk very briefly about it and then let Kelsey from IRC speak more about this as they have a lot of projects running. But just to point out a few of the requirements to achieve meaningful financial inclusion. First of all, there is a need to look at financial inclusion and economic participation for all. Even though the Central Bank of Jordan identifies in its national financial inclusion strategy as refugees as a very important stakeholder, non-Syrians still remain excluded. And similarly, for the labor market measures, non-Syrians still remain included. So there is the need to look at all refugees and have sort of a one refugee approach. At the same time, it's important to provide refugees with reliable ways to store money and to build savings. While mobile wallets is a kind of store of account which is available to them right now, but the usage still remains very low. And even the awareness about it remains low. However, in the recent COVID lockdown, there was a lot of awareness about mobile wallets, and even the government, even the central bank allowed digital registration. This has seen an increase in the uptake of mobile wallets. However, most of our respondents at least were not aware on how this might be relevant for them and how they can use it. Again,
ask you to maybe give one final thought and pass it over to Kelsey.
And again, for entrepreneurs, it's important to look beyond just mobile wallets and provide them with a wider suite of financial services and bank accounts, and allow them to use bank accounts so as to enable their businesses over the longer term. Over to you, Kelsey. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. That was really interesting. And I just want to note that our partnership with Swati and the FIND research has been really useful in putting data to what we commonly are seeing already on the ground in a lot of our programming. So you can move to the next slide. Sorry, next slide after that. I just want to talk briefly about, we can move to the next slide. Thanks. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Rural Livelihoods Officer with the Economic Recovery and Development Unit of IRC, and me and a few of my co-workers lead a lot of the technical programming and advice when it comes around what we do for financial inclusion overall, and a lot of that does focus on forcibly displaced people. So just to touch on where we're implementing the roadmap, which has been a really useful tool in kind of lining out recommendations that we are enacting upon in our programming, but also in a few other areas. So as Swati mentioned, we're working with them on kind of closing the knowledge gap and really putting data to a lot of what I think we all see on the ground, but it's important to have that number and data behind it and to just better understand some of the key issues. Our teams also work on both advocacy and our teams, our field teams, work to advocate for improved and inclusive regulatory frameworks that address the needs of forcibly displaced persons. And this is really just by pushing even the local legislation, but also working with government and ministries to try and advocate for what we've been seeing. You can go to the next slide. And through our programming, and I think this is really what is probably the most interesting to all of you, is what we actually do in our programming to try and increase financial inclusion for this group. First off, I want to note that through our humanitarian cash assistance, which is a large part of our emergency programming, we're committed to increasing the use of digital cash and linking to social protection programs to kind of help bridge the humanitarian development divide. And this is one of the key recommendations for the roadmap. But in our actual more explicit financial inclusion programming, we really look at addressing some of the core barriers that GIZ and also Afi already discussed, and Swati kind of reiterated in the numbers she's seeing. So we work to really address the core barriers to financial exclusion, not just access for FDPs, but also their understanding, usage, and confidence in using financial institutions. We've seen that while maybe there is access in some areas, they do not have full awareness or understanding of why these are useful for them. Or sometimes it's even just included in that they don't have full confidence that if they go to a bank or if they go to a banking agent, that they'll be treated the same, and that can hinder especially more vulnerable groups like women, people with lower literacy rates, to want to even try and access financial institutions and services. So one of the main things we do in a lot of our programming is looking at linking groups and individuals to formal financial institutions. We also provide continual training on financial service products available in the area. Oh, sorry. Is that a little bit better for everyone? We also, as I was saying, we do a lot of foundational work. It's not just the linkage, but also ensuring that we're building financial literacy skills and also digital literacy skills as digital tools are becoming increasingly more available and increasing the access to groups that tend to be left out. We also do continual training on financial service products to increase awareness, but also to increase kind of the understanding of how these products differ, what risks come with these products, to really ensure that the people we're working with have a good understanding and can protect themselves rather than just being recommended something and taking that recommendation. We also, even depending on the level of the group, end up doing a lot of support throughout the administrative process of helping them open maybe a savings account. And that can be even just to ensure that they have their IDs and registrations in order, but also other process that sometimes really just comes with maybe kind of helping build their confidence in working through that process. So we not only provide a lot of skills and training to groups and individuals that are looking to access financial services, but also we've been developing a network of what we call community-based trainers who can provide that support that a lot of IRC staff is usually providing, but in a long-term fashion. So when our projects end, there is a sustainable network of people who can help FDPs and other vulnerable populations continue to link with and access financial services and continue to kind of build that ecosystem. We're also working very closely with banks to build the trust and confidence with the FDP communities and to adapt their services and products to meet the needs of those communities. So really we're looking kind of at the whole ecosystem and not just one little aspect, and really focusing on access and inclusion. You can go to the next slide.
Kelsey, I'm gonna just ask you to wrap up now if possible.
Okay. Yeah, so I just want to mention that we do have some impacts that we noticed, and actually you can go to the last slide, which is recommendations. So I think these recommendations, a lot of them have already been hit on. I think the one I'd like to pull out the most is that we are a little worried that MFIs may, in this economic recession, not be bailed out or supported along with banks in the financial section bailouts, and that really concerns us. So I think for regulators, we would say that upon all of these other recommendations, we also want to make sure MFIs are included in any sort of bailouts that would be considered for larger banks and the formal financial sector in total. And then I'm happy to answer more questions in our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey and Swati. Very useful and practical presentations. I'm now going to pass it back to our colleague from the National Bank of Rwanda, which will require going back in the slides. And Moise, would you like to? Take a few minutes now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to share the experience in the roadmap to sustainable and responsible financial inclusion for forcibly displaced people. Allow me just to start mentioning that the government of Rwanda maintains the policy to protect and advance the rights of refugees, and it is stipulated in the law that governs refugees in Rwanda. This law provides refugees with the right to work, the right of freedom to movement, and access to documentation such as identity cards and any other relevant document. However, the rapid livelihood assessment that was conducted by UNHCR along with Ministry of Emergency Management in 2019 revealed that refugees are still facing challenges such as limited access to loans, limited access to land and for farming, limited access to market-based vocational training, but also limited access to financial education, to name but few. So to address these issues, there is need, as my colleagues have mentioned in their presentation, for multi-stakeholders collaboration. That's why you can see in my slides mentioning different key stakeholders. The first one includes Ministry of Emergency Management. The second one is UNHCR. And the third one is NIDA, that is National Identification Agency, that is basically giving documentation to refugees, and which documentation become the basis of getting some access to financial services. So just to mention that in Rwanda, we have Minema and UNHCR have recently concluded the registration of all the refugees so that they can have access to this documentation that are used by financial service providers to offer services to this group. So this has positively impacted refugees by giving them access to documentation, which documentation facilitates them to get employment, to move more freely, but also to get access to financial services. Just to give an example of how digital financial services have been quite useful, refugees in 3 of the camps that we are having, we actually have 6 camps in Rwanda. 3 of these camps, people are now receiving the transfers from UNHCR, not in kind of food, but in terms of money, and transferred through the mobile money account. So it's better to mention the role of the regulator. The National Bank of Rwanda, as the regulator, collaborates with different financial service providers and different key stakeholders to advance financial inclusion for forcibly displaced people. And among most of the things that it has done, it's putting in place regulations that support these forcibly displaced people's financial inclusion. One of them that I mentioned here is non-deposit taking lending financial institution, which is already there and which is now helping different companies that are registering under this regulatory framework to support forcibly displaced people. So we've done well in financial inclusion, but we still have some challenges as far as forcibly displaced people is concerned. Just to mention that we are at 93% of financial inclusion and 77% of formal financial inclusion as per FinScope 2020, but we still have data gap for forcibly displaced people. So what the central bank has done is giving the right for NDFI to operate, and one of the NDFIs that has got the right to operate has served 12,800 refugees, and these are the number of people that it has served in different camps, and this has put in place the COVID Relief Fund, which supports especially forcibly displaced people, and as of now, they have already served 1,000 refugees and host communities. Just to conclude, we hope that forcibly displaced people will be included and will be part of our journey through our financial inclusion that is leaving no one behind. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you so much, especially for those concrete and impressive numbers.